I promised you all a tutorial on this image in Photoshop. So what we're going to do is go in and do some basic retouching, then do some advanced distortion removal, and we're going to apply some color grading and effects to it. And then kind of counterintuitively, we're going to remove some image distractions using clone and heal tools. So let's get started. First thing we're going to do is a very basic retouch. Using the auto option um, gets me pretty close. And then what I can do is I can reduce the highlights, open up the shadows, and play with the whites and blacks if necessary. I want to add a little bit of texture, clarity, and dehaze to bring back some of that contrast that I lost from slamming the highlights and shadows open. We're going to create some guides that define the original image boundaries. Why we do this will become clear as we continue along, and I'll try to make sure I highlight it. We're going to increase the canvas size. Really, we only do this so we have some more room to undertake the next step, and you'll see why when we complete the next operation. Next thing I'm going to do is generate a frame for visualization purposes, and I'm going to do this by pre-selecting the frame that I want. So what I'm going to do is press Control A to select the canvas, and then I'm going to select Control Alt and click on the image layer. This operation will remove the original image area from the full canvas, leaving us with just the frame that we can then fill with a solid color adjustment layer. On the original image, you want to make sure it's a smart object. Then we're going to go into the adaptive wide angle filter. Inside the filter, you'll see 5 tools. We have the constraint tool, the polygon constraint tool, the move tool, the hand tool, and the zoom tool. And they're all fairly self-explanatory. The primary one we're going to utilize is the constraint tool because that will allow us to control how the image looks and help remove some of these distortions. Using the constraint tool, we want to draw on the canvas to define what lines want to be straight. If you look toward the right side of the interface, you'll see a detail view that gives you a zoomed in visualization of wherever your cursor is. When you look at the correction options, you have fisheye, perspective, auto, and full spherical. Fisheye removes barrel distortions. Perspective obviously removes perspective leanings. Auto will auto recognize what lens you took it with and help to remove some of the issues. Full spherical is for special cases for fully spherical images, but there's all kinds of requirements around it. When you draw a line on the canvas, by default you get the fisheye option. Then what I will do is I'll pop through and try some different ones until I find the one that seems to do the best job. In this case, it's the perspective correction. Each of the corrections gives you the ability to modify its scale, focal length, and crop factor. These will adjust some different parameters and tailor the image to your taste. Typically, I just play around with them until I get something that looks the way that I want. Now is where that canvas extension that we did earlier comes into play. What I will typically do is grab the lines that I drew on the canvas and extend them out beyond the bounds of the image. So it takes the correction, instead of just making it a local correction, it actually modifies the entire image. As you drop these lines, you can see the image lock itself toward the constraint that you just applied. You can then also right mouse button on any line that you have created and constrain it further to either horizontal or vertical. You can also draw the constraint lines automatically tied to horizontal and vertical simply by dragging a line that's close to vertical and holding down the shift key, or the same thing for the horizontal lines. You may find times when you drag the line too far and you end up with a hyphenated red representation. Simply move back toward the image and it will allow you to place the line appropriately. The more lines you add, the better the distortion correction is going to be. You can go in and add a ton of lines. In this particular image, there's lots and lots of straight lines, so obviously I can try to match those, and what I will do is I will draw inside the image and then pull those lines to the outside to correct the distortion on the entire image. So what you'll see is you can continually add lines, constrain them to vertical, horizontal, whatever you need to get the image to look the way that you visualize. So I'm going to speed this part up a bit, and you can see it's already fast forwarding. So you'll see a ton of different lines on this particular image come together, and what it will do is yield a more visually correct image without all the distortions from the original photo. Now I'll use the correction options to modify the parameters for scale, focal length, crop factor to get the image that I want. Typically I only play with scale just to make it look exactly the way that I imagine. Now I'll use the move tool to position the corrected image approximately where I think it needs to be on the canvas. Now I will accept all the positioning and corrections that I've done and hit OK and push this back out to the main image so I can see the adjustments on the smart object with the frame. Now we want to remove the frame that we had originally created because it's really only there for visualization purposes. What we want to deal with is the image that looks like it was cropped there with the black frame. So ultimately that's what we want to get to. Now we're going to create a new empty layer using Control Shift N. Then we're going to use Control Shift Alt and E to create a stamp visible layer, or essentially a snapshot in time of what this image looks like. Next, we're going to shift operations. We're going to shut off the smart object and we're going to work on the stamp visible layer. And we're going to reposition it and maybe change the scale a little bit to manipulate the composition inside of the frame. And you can see the frame is still represented from those guides. So what I'm going to do is just simply resize, reposition to make it look the way that I want it to look for a final image. Next, we're going to crop the image using the crop tool and those guides that we created earlier. So we can generate this image down to the dimensions of our previous, the unedited, the one that's all distorted and things like that. We want to get back to that. But you also want to make sure you have delete cropped pixels on, because delete cropped pixels will actually trim off the outside of that image. So we can end up with the final image that we then want to work with. Now we're going to clear the guides just to get rid of them and clean up our display a little bit. If you notice the lower left and right corners, we've got some areas that our distortion corrections have left transparency, so there's no data there available to fill those areas. So what we're going to do is we're going to have to go in and recreate that information. The first thing we're going to do is use the magic wand tool to select those areas, and then we're going to take that selection that's generated and go in and manipulate the selection to enlarge it, and we'll use a value of say 50 pixels to enlarge it into the image, and then go in and use content aware fill. And based on what we've selected and where we've let it leak into the image, it's going to read that information and fill that and try to make it look like it fits there. And you can see it does a great job. Now that we got the image looking the way that we want to get rid of the smart object because it will significantly reduce our file size. Those things are fantastic. You can get lots of information, lots of capability, but they really do significantly inflate your file size. And comically, now that I've told you to get rid of the smart object, we're going to convert this image into a smart object because what we want to do is we want to make some changes and manipulations to the image, but we want it to be intelligent so we can go back and modify them later. Now we're going to go in and apply an adjustment, a shadows and highlights adjustment. The shadows and highlights adjustment isn't available as an adjustment layer, so using the smart object we can still get it to behave like an adjustment layer in that it becomes a smart filter underneath the smart object. In the adjustment, on the shadows and the highlights, we can use the amount, which essentially opens them up or closes them down, depending on whether you're working with shadows or highlights. The tone, which shifts the midpoint, and the radius, which adds contrast to that particular channel. When adjusting the color and midtone options, you essentially add vibrance and kind of like clarity. It's a midtone contrast enhancement or reduction. Since we applied the adjustment to a smart object, you'll see that the shadow and highlight adjustment actually shows up as a smart filter underneath the smart object. So then we can go back and modify and manipulate it at any point in time. The next thing that I do is clean up these masks that are left over from any adjustment layers and things like that. I just don't like a lot of these things laying around. It just clutters up my display and I find it irritating. Next, we're going to do some color toning. There's about 150 different ways to do this in Photoshop. The way that I'm going to show you is using solid color adjustment layers, and we'll go through that, but you can do it any way that makes sense to you and gets you what you want. The first thing we're going to do is add a solid color adjustment layer to add our desired colors to the image. We're going to apply a slightly desaturated and brightened orange color to the highlights. Now I'm going to remove my layer mask just to clean up my layer panel. Next, I'm going to change the blend mode on this layer so it interacts differently with the image. The vivid light blend mode creates a really nice cast that I like. I'm going to pay attention specifically to the highlights because what I'm going to do is limit this to the highlights in the following step. What we want to do is double click on the right side of the layer to access the layer styles and the blending options inside of those layer styles. Using blend if from the layer blending options, we can limit this to our highlights, our shadows, any combination thereof, and make it look exactly the way that we want. We want to work on the gray channel because what we're concerned with is the highlights and the shadows, which obviously are scales of gray. And we want to remove this layer from the underlying layer. So if you look, you have this layer and underlying layer. So we want to remove from the underlying layer. So what we're going to do is we're going to utilize those dark triangles and those light triangles to pull away from the shadows and pull away from the highlights. As you pull the triangles away from the deepest blacks, you'll notice that it starts to pull that vivid light effect away from the darkest darks. But you can see we're left with a very hard edge, sharp effect. To soften these edges, you can press the Alt or Option key and click on the black triangles and it will separate them and you spread them apart. So effectively, the one that's furthest towards the white has 100% effect. The one that's furthest toward the black has 0% effect. So you can see it creates that feathery smooth transition for you. Now we're going to do the same thing for the whites and highlights, pulling that main triangle, Alt or Option key to split it, and drag feather until we get the effect we're looking for. The next step we're going to do is modify how the vivid light layer blends into the underlying layers. Because this is one of the special blend modes, we're going to use the fill opacity and drop it down, say 35, 36, somewhere in that vicinity. Next, we're going to add some color toning to the shadows. We're going to do this a little bit differently. It's a technique that I use from time to time. I want the exact opposite color from the orange that we had. So what I want to do is I'm going to duplicate that same color. Then what I'm going to do is clear the layer styles, and what this is going to do is reset the blend mode to normal, remove all opacity adjustments and blend if functions and all those kinds of things I did, and it will leave me essentially with a clean solid color adjustment layer. Next, I'm going to add an invert adjustment layer, and what this is going to do is take that orange layer and give me the exact complement, and by clipping it to that orange layer, it's only going to affect that single layer so we can drive this directly to our shadows. On the second color layer, I want to do essentially the same things. We're going to go into blend if and adjust, pull it away from the highlights and tweak it into the shadows and feather it out and get the effect that we want so that blue color is only affecting the shadows. Next, I want to modify the blend mode. There's no hard fast rules as to what works. It's really a matter of selecting what makes sense to you. And to me, the multiply blend mode looks best on this particular image. So I'll do that, and then I'll tweak the opacity so I get what I'm looking for and I'm satisfied with the image. And now for my own logistical layer controls, I want to move the highlights above the shadows. You don't have to do this, it's just the step that I do so I understand where things are. This is where we're going to end off on this particular video. I will continue in another video where we start to do some cloning and healing and removing some of the distractions like the people in here, things like that. But hopefully you get lots of different tips for removing distortions and doing some color toning and things like that. Stay tuned.